As unrest intensified in 1970s Britain, a group of young people decided to fight against fascism, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, factory bosses, and the Conservative government. Armed with guns, bombs, and a sense of humour, they called themselves the Angry Brigade, and their story culminated in what became the longest criminal trial in the UK to date. This is Working Class History.
Oh, bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Before we get on with the main episodes, just a reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes, bonus episodes, ad-free episodes, free and discounted merch and other content. For example, our Patreon supporters can listen to both parts of this double episode now, as well as an exclusive bonus episode. Join us or find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Long-term listeners might recall that our episodes 2 to 3 were about the Angry Brigade. However, like all of our first episodes, it was basically raw audio from our interview, so the sound quality wasn't great. There wasn't narrative to fill any gaps, explain context, and pull the story together. So, in addition to making new episodes for you, we're still going back over our earliest episodes to re-edit and release them in this new narrative format that we use for all of our later episodes. So we've added quite a lot of information here to explain things better and tell the story in a kind of cohesive way. So we hope you enjoy it, whether you listen to the original one or not. We've decided to redo this episode now because recently we've produced a number of episodes about the same time period in the UK. So our episodes 65 to 66 were about the 1972 Builders' Strike, 67 to 68 were about the Grunwick Strike also in the 70s, and our episode 81 was about miners' strikes around the same time.
The Angry Brigade itself first emerged in the summer of 1970 in the run-up to the election of the Conservative government of Edward Heath, and its activities continued for 18 months. The Angry Brigade actions, intended as symbolic, were followed by communiques explaining why the targets had been chosen and the group's commitment to rank-and-file organisation and international solidarity. Targets included the embassies of repressive regimes, high-profile police stations and army barracks, sweatshop boutiques and factories, as well as government buildings. The homes of cabinet ministers, the Attorney General and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police were also targeted. Scotland Yard and MI5 launched a massive investigation which led, in August 1971, to a number of arrests and 2 major trials at the Old Bailey.
This was Stuart Christie, a Scottish anarchist who was arrested and charged with being part of the Angry Brigade, who died in 2020. This clip's from a documentary film about the group, which we're using courtesy of PM Press, and the documentary is also available on the link in the show notes. We're going to use a few more clips from this documentary later on in these episodes as well. Going back a couple of decades before this point during World War II, Western countries like the UK and US were allied with the Soviet Union in the fight against the Axis powers, principally Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy and Imperial Japan. When the war ended, the Cold War soon began, a period of escalating tensions between the West and the expanded Soviet bloc. These culminated to the point where there was a very real risk of all-out nuclear war. This absurd threat was something which provoked mass protests around the world.
When I was sort of 15 or 16, I think like a lot of people, I went on CND marches. Campaign for nuclear disarmament, because when I would have been about 15, I think, when the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 or 3. And I actually remember going to school and we were talking in the schoolyard, is this it? Is this going to be our... So it was quite, you look at it in retrospect and you said, well, but it was quite real. So I went on CND marches, and then I went to university to be a proper serious student.
This is John Barker, who was also later on trial for being part of the Angry Brigade. My co-host Matt and I caught up with him at his flat in London.
And I went to Cambridge, and I worked quite hard as a student, but I found it was very. I come from lower middle class family. but in Cambridge to run really into the ruling class, actually, or the ruling class being reproduced, was quite kind of shock, because it was like in your face. You could see this is what it was. So this gay started to give me a bit of an edge. And the other thing, the other dominant, which of course people who'd been in CND would then be involved in, was the war in Vietnam. This was another thing when I was in. So I went on, also various marches. Had my first arrest at Grosvenor Square in 1968, I think.
Right, that was when there was a big
Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, this was in Grosvenor Square. It was a mass demonstration. And it was my first experience, actually, where you found there were people at the back saying, "Forward, charge," and you charge forward, and you find suddenly there's nobody behind you. So that was my first kind of, let's wise up a bit.
We, and I'm sure many of our listeners, will have also had similar experiences with this kind of situation, with self-declared leaders or back row generals trying to direct others.
Vanguard at the back. Yes, it was like the First World War with officers in the rear, but it was just it ended up as a fine, and then at university I met an slightly older group of people who were situationists, and situationists is now, unfortunately, also a kind of archive commodity, but situationists were a very radical group built around a very important text by Guy Debord called the Society of the Spectacle, and this kind of gave a much more imaginative edge to politics, and there was a kind of slight arrogance to it. They were very dismissive of it. This is all it's all being recuperated. It's all bourgeois. It's all which is admittedly but there was also a lot of fun.
The Situationists were a group of revolutionary Marxist artists and intellectuals in France who formed the Situationist International. They were among the first to theorise capitalism in its post-war consumerist phase. They argued that the relative material affluence of the working class wasn't enough to stop class struggle, but it was just another source of alienation. John mentions their concept of recuperation. This is the process by which capitalism can incorporate elements of resistance back into itself, rendering them harmless and even profitable. A good example of recuperation in culture could be punk music. Originally grassroots protest music, now t-shirts of punk bands are sold in high street chains to sell an image of rebellion. Recuperation happens in politics as well. Trade unions, for instance, began as illegal fighting organisations of working class people, but in many places were eventually incorporated into a legalistic industrial relations framework in which workers' discontent is more easily managed. And in some places like the UK, unions have even been incorporated to an extent into the management of the state, where they call on members to accept wage restraint. For example, during the Winter of Discontent of 1978-9. This is what Situationists meant by the recuperation of struggle. Though the Situationist International were always a very small group, their ideas became highly influential on radical thinking, particularly during the events of France in 1968. We've got some books about the Situationists in our online store, available on the link in the show notes. The Situationists also organised situations, or happenings, aimed at puncturing the monotony of everyday life.
We invaded May balls and
Mabel's.
May balls.
Oh, Mabel balls
May
in
balls
May.
are the kind of things you had at Cambridge, where
Right.
people go in dinner jackets, and Cambridge has all these colleges, and each college would have this May ball, and they'd have a band. They have lots of bands and champagne, and you paid so much, and I think you had to go in a dinner jacket. And I think this would be in my last year. We invaded one in one of the colleges, climbing over the walls. And
In dinner jackets?
No. So that was that, and it was an outlet for the real kind of hatred I developed for this world in Cambridge, which was then manifested when a group of us decided that we would not take our finals as a protest against. What we said was that education was an elitist system, that its main function was one of exclusion, and that Cambridge was at one of the pinnacles of this process of exclusion, and also in several other universities something similar happened. People tried to present it as a protest against exams, as if we'd had continuous assessment it would have been okay, which it wasn't at all. And it was the first time I've been involved in we did a lot of street theatre, and come the day, I think there was 7 of us, ripped up our papers and said down with elitism, down with assessment, something like that. And again, I look at this in retrospect, and you think, well, it's a bit, perhaps this is quixotic, and that looking at how young people are now, maybe it was a luxury for us that we could do this, that you didn't have this, this terrible anxiety about getting a job, all this stuff. On the other hand, it's the one thing I have never regretted doing.
Indeed, looking back from 2023, it can sometimes be hard to understand where people are coming from in different points of the past. So at this time, mass working class struggles for years had forced significant concessions to improve workers' living standards and public services. Free university education and even getting grants covering your living expenses sounds like a great deal now that grants are long gone and fees have been introduced and then increased year on year. After university, John moved to the capital.
I went to London, went to Notting Hill, which was then, this is where there was a group of, it was called King Mob Echo, which was the kind of the public face of British situationism, who did quite, kind of witty, subversive stuff, did some wonderful graffiti. And the first thing that happened, because actually though you could get a job, it was also you could go on the dole, and you could basically survive on the dole. And I became involved in the West London Claimants Union. One of the things that I do regret is that that I didn't continue, because I think it was a kind of model organisation in which the rule was you either had to be on the dole or to have been on the dole in the last 12 months. So it avoided any kind of professionalisation of the thing. And we would have actions in solidarity, we'd go to dole offices to defend people because there was a whole big thing about particularly women on the dole, and did they have a man sleeping with them, and then they were going to get cut off, this kind of, so you'd go and argue the case en masse in welfare offices. And also because at this time, coincidentally, the Mangrove restaurant was the crucial focal point of radical politics in the area, and you had a very, very heavy, oppressive police presence.
The Mangrove was a Caribbean restaurant run by Frank Critchlow at the centre of the Black Power movement in London at that time. It was subjected to repeated police raids, which Home Office documents later revealed were part of a plot to try to disrupt radical black organising. During a protest against the raids, 9 black Londoners were arrested and charged with conspiracy to incite a riot. Their story is told in the recent Steve McQueen film, Small Axe. To clarify for non-UK listeners, the dole here refers to unemployment benefits.
Subsequently, they also went on trial. It's called the Mangrove trial, which becomes extremely relevant to my own trial. But anyway, they were the focus, and there was a lot of police. And somehow even though we were kind of long-haired hippies, they got on with it. We got on with them fine, and were involved in various demonstrations against the police.
John and his friends also got involved in other activities, like producing a radical newsletter called Strike and supporting the local community. This was heavily working class at the time, very different to Notting Hill today, where the average property costs over £1.5 million.
And then one of the things that you think, yeah, I'm really glad I did this, and it stands out, was that, and this was very much the local situationist initiative, but in some coordination with, particularly with a radical group of mothers looking for a playground. And at this time, Paris Square, which is a square just off Portobello Road, was still a private square. You had to have a key to get in the square. And we invaded the square, and with the knowing, and the women immediately followed this up to set up a playground in the square, and it's still there now. It's still a public space.
The movement which John identified with was the libertarian movement. Nowadays, many people associate the word libertarian with right-wing free market ideology, but the word was originally coined by a French anarchist communist, Joseph Déjacque, in the mid-19th century. It's a term which is more broad than just anarchist, which generally applies to the whole wing of the left which seeks to achieve revolutionary change from below by workers ourselves and not through a state by politicians. So it includes anarchists, but also a good number of others, including some strains of Marxists and communists, like the situationists.
The big thing from, let's say, the libertarian movement was to say, that the revolution is not some telos in the, it's not something that, we'll get the revolution and it'll be, in a way, the way that you lived, the way that you acted was part of making the revolution. I mean, and then, people theorise it is a revolution of everyday life, which I think is kind of, it's not quite that, but it was certainly the notion that how you lived, how you behaved to each other, comradeship, the idea of living communally and so on, that this was, I think, a really big change which starts at this, and of course this is fueled by the women's movement and of course by the Black Power movement.
In his very BBC kind of way, journalist Gordon Carr tries to explain how ideas of living in urban communes spread from the revolutionary counterculture in Germany to the UK.
The commune, in fact, is the fundamental unit of the whole revolutionary libertarian idea. It's the commune experience, they say, that's important. You can't expect people brought up in the old society to fit into the alternative without some drastic changes. And for that, it's essential first to break down the family unit, to develop non-family relationships. But of course, liberated women have children, and a great deal of care is put into bringing them up to fit into the world they want. Commune children eat, sleep and play together. Outside the commune, they join in what's known as kindergarten. Originally, these groups were set up to allow commune mothers more time to attend political demonstrations. But a system soon began to build itself into the plan. The children were encouraged to develop free from any kind of inhibition, free from any competitive instinct. In Britain, these experiments in revolutionary lifestyle were slower to catch on. But when they did, it was in the Notting Hill area of West London that they first took root.
This was the moment when libertarian communism was asserting itself in a lot of ways, and which coalesced briefly around the 1970 election, when we had, I think, the first demonstration that actually went through the City of London, the finance district, on election day, saying, don't vote, it makes sense. Because I think it makes sense was one of the, I think it was the Labour Party's slogan.
The 1970 election was the one which was lost by Labour's Howard Wilson. Former miner Dave Douglas spoke about this in our episode 81, explaining how disillusioned many people were with his government, which was elected with a huge mandate and a huge majority and a pledge to implement socialism, but didn't really do much in terms of implementing socialist policies. Quite the opposite, in fact, in many cases. This same time period had a great deal of industrial unrest, with frequent strikes, which John and his friends intervened in with differing levels of success.
And in the funny experience, because I wasn't in the trade union and was a layabout basically, really. But we had two completely different experiences with the claimants as claimants unions. We went. There was a postal strike. I think it was in 1970. And we went and leafleted postal workers on strike, showing them how they could claim benefits and so on, and got very well received. And then the same thing happened with the printers' strike in London. We were doing the same thing, and they were saying, "Fuck off, you long-haired layabouts." So that give us this, that was completely different reactions.
In the early 1970s, it was a lot easier to be a layabout than it is today.
Well, no, it wasn't just, no, I had to, sometimes when I had to work, and we were doing, that became known in our trial, we were also doing cheque fraud, which was, fraud was much easier in those days. Well, I should explain, cheques, where perhaps people don't use them at all anymore. So it was a way you could steal a chequebook, create some, so we became quite adept at creating ID, which again was much easier. It was none of this, now. It's creating ID now is difficult.
Yeah.
Really professional work. So there was a combination of the dole and cheque fraud.
You could then use the checks and fake IDs to pay for things you needed, like groceries and clothing. To supplement his income, John occasionally engaged in wage labour as well.
And a bit of part, and sometimes you could get on work on a building site for a couple of months. So it was a mix of all these things. And just to say once again, it was so much easier then. At all levels. I mean, rents were relative to what you earned much cheaper.
As we discuss in our podcast bonus episode 81.1, while nowadays the 1970s is referred to like it was a grim and nightmarish time with dead bodies and rubbish piled up in the streets and no electricity, in reality it was the time period with the lowest economic inequality in British history, with the highest standards of living for working class people. This relative affluence had its origins in World War II.
My mum and dad and a lot of other mums, they fought this war. They fought this war for the state.
World War II.
Yeah, World War II. They fought this, right? And in a way, they had to be rewarded. And us, the kids, we got the reward. We got free university education, all this. And this
without fighting the war.
Without fighting, this was a reward for the children of the parents who'd done it. I only think about this in retrospect, but I'm sure this was the case. And at a certain time around 1975, the ruling class suddenly said, "Fuck this! We've paid you off now. That's you're not having anything." Because you could say, "Oh well, maybe from one point of view, you could say, well, we took the piss." Actually, that suddenly having this relatively easy situation, we took the piss, but this was a whole. It wasn't just a few. Drop out layabouts. I mean, this was, I think, the young working class actually was assertive. You see it. Culturally at all levels that there was this real self-confidence. And if you'd been brought up as I was in the as a kid in the 1950s, this was extraordinary, really. That the voice of authority, in a way, it wasn't just hippies and so on. It was actually a voice of authority being, I think, seriously undermined and obviously they expected. The expectation was from, let's say, the ruling class, was that you would have a highly educated, you'd now be creating a highly educated generation who would now be, the white heat of technology and so on and so forth. And obviously, a lot of young people did become part of the white heat of technology, and a lot of people didn't, and asserted themselves in a lot of ways. And now you see people writing about this now as if it was a sociological truth that it was much more creative in those times, precisely because you could survive on the dole because rent didn't strangle you.
Some people on the left seem to think that workers only rebel if their conditions are truly dire, and feel that better off workers will be content with the status quo. But this attitude isn't borne out by historical events. In the early 1970s in developed countries, as well as huge strikes and protests, there was widespread revolt against work itself. Absenteeism, that is, workers just not bothering to turn up to work, lost far more working days than strikes did. In Italy, Fiat factories had an absentee rate of 18%. Car manufacturers in Sweden had absentee rates of 15 to 25% a day. In Britain, it was generally a bit lower, more like 6% on average, but at one car factory, nearly a third of the workers didn't turn up on a given day. One US auto worker was asked what work at his factory was like on Mondays in summer. He said he didn't know because he'd never been in for one. Another was asked why he only turned up to work 4 days per week. He replied, "Because I can't make enough money in 3. In addition to this generally rebellious atmosphere, there were a number of other key factors which contributed to some people starting to think that armed guerrilla activity would be both justified and beneficial.
It's a combination of things. First of all, as I think I said before, the actual level of repression in it. So it began really as internationalist levels of repression of comrades in Spain and Italy.
Spain at the time was still run by the brutal Franco dictatorship.
Spain still run by in which comrades were being garroted, and in Italy, where, as in the famous play called Accidental Death of an Anarchist, where comrades are being thrown out of high windows in police buildings and so on.
Yeah.
So there's, in a way, it begins as a notion of international solidarity. The other context is, of course, what's going on in Ireland, which from 1968 onwards is becoming, actually, again, in retrospect, I think deliberately militarised by the British state. So there is suddenly political violence is not I can't say un-British.
But in a way it is.
Irish comrades wouldn't say this, but there's this going on. And also, I mean, from my own point of view, class hatred. Now, I know that class hatred in itself is insufficient to make anything. And as I said before, we also thought, well, it's how you act, how you try and live out a kind of communist way of living with each other, rather than looking at the revolution as a telos. But on the other hand, I do believe, and I still believe, that without class hatred, nothing actually moves, because class hatred is when you see how much actually people's lives are caged in, there's a kind of meanness to it all the time, and obviously in recent years this meanness has actually become so manifest in that brief period in which I was lucky enough to be a young person. They were never going to have this again, never going to have a confident working class and you could see, I think that at this time, I don't want to think I was clairvoyant or so bloody clever, but I think there is a moment that you can see around as early as 1971 that you can see that there's a shift in that capital is going to go on the offensive, that they've had enough of this. The rate of profit is, I don't know enough about the rate of profit. I'm just saying it's instinctive that you felt this. They've had enough of this culturally. They don't like this confident working class, both in the United States and here, and they don't like the kind of labour indiscipline that they really don't like this.
To this naked state violence in Spain, Italy and Ireland, some people decided it was time to respond in kind.
And rightly or wrongly, people I knew thought that there should be some attacks on individual representatives of this thing. One of the clear things, we read a text by a man called Martin Nicolaus, who wrote about why does sociology Why does sociology focus solely on the poor? Why is there no sociology of the rich? And he argued this very well, and it was quite easy to see they're quite difficult. They don't want to be examined. They don't want to be under a torchlight. And there was I think amongst various comrades was the idea that you couldn't just say that these were inevitable decisions, or that actually individuals within the elite made decisions which affected the lives of thousands of other people without affecting their own lives. So I think this was the motivation.
At the same time, through connections to the underground resistance to Franco, long-haired countercultural dropouts in London had access to weapons, explosives, and bomb-making instructions from people with years of experience of guerrilla warfare.
I think these were very, very well-known skills from the Spanish anarchist movement, which were passed on by word of mouth. The technique was in fact very, very simple, and I think had been used for a long time, and were, fairly reliable in terms of timing and so on.
Mm-hmm. The 1st of May group was an anti-Franco guerrilla group formed by Spanish anarchist exiles. They undertook a number of attacks around Europe.
August the 20th, 1967. The time, 11:15. A white Ford Cortina drives down Park Lane in London's West End. In the car, 3 men, young Spanish anarchists. They turn into Grosvenor Square, draw alongside the American Embassy,
This machine gun attack on the US Embassy was in solidarity with the Vietnamese anti-colonial struggle, the US Black Liberation Movement, and with liberation movements in Latin America, fighting against various US-backed right-wing dictatorships. In 1968 and 1969, they bombed Spanish government and bank buildings in London. The first action attributed to the Angry Brigade by prosecutors was a bomb which didn't go off, but was planted in the new Paddington police station in May 1971. Part of the police station had specifically been built to house Irish independence fighters. The political situation in Spain and elsewhere was obviously extremely dangerous and serious. Those who formed the Angry Brigade acknowledged that their situation was very different, and while they wanted to show solidarity with revolutionaries elsewhere, they had a pretty light-hearted approach, which should be clear from their name.
It was a silly name, actually. Yes, I think yes. Yeah, I think there was a sense of humour. I mean, the other thing that it's difficult to say from as the relatively easy time. We were also in a real drug culture, and I took quite a lot of acid. I'm not saying that acid, I mean, if you look again retrospective, I mean, acid was very good for me, actually. I think it did. It opened up kind of. You thought, well, no, this. I mean, particularly in relation to authority, it really made authority just ludicrous. And there was a lot of grass around. People, it was very much a hedonistic drug culture, and that was part of this. This class confidence, what I would call working class audacity, which was hedonistic in a way which was not so consumerist, actually.
After Paddington Police Station, a string of other attacks followed, which largely went unreported by the press. These included bombings of the home of Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir John Waldron and 2 separate bombings of the home of Attorney General Sir Peter Rawlinson. It's important to point out that all these acts were planned very deliberately not to injure or kill anyone. While these actions might seem extremely serious, the Angry Brigade didn't take themselves very seriously at all.
It's difficult to say that you're very serious about your politics, and at a certain level you don't feel massively serious in yourself. Now, this is maybe a fault, I don't know, maybe if you are going to be really serious, you have to be really serious, and I'm not saying one thing or another, but there was a feeling that we were serious about what we believed, serious about that we were going to act on what we believed, but not serious in the sense that we were going to change the world, take state power, program, so on and so forth.
Looking back today, this might seem really strange, especially for younger people in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and the War on Terror, and for slightly older people in the UK after decades of bomb attacks by the Irish Republican Army, IRA. But 1970 was before all that, really, and the environment was completely different.
That context is obviously crucially important. I mean, there was, in 1972, I think it was 1972, the Old Bailey bombing. I mean, this really changed everything.
This bombing actually happened in 1973. But this was a car bomb placed outside London's most famous courthouse, the Old Bailey, with another which went off outside the Ministry of Agriculture. This was the first major attack on the British mainland since the start of the Troubles, which killed 1 and injured over 200 people. After this, terrorism in the UK became a big deal, much like it did in the US after 9/11.
The idea was strictly to damage property and not damage people. So you can say, in a way, that this was again, retrospectively, I can say this is an extension of the theatre, kind of street theatre we were doing in the anti-assessment campaign as students. That it was a kind of theatre with an edge, I suppose. And obviously now, I mean, you would be A, totally counter-revolutionary, and B, suicidal to be doing stuff like this.
Another factor worth bearing in mind was that the same thing was happening in other wealthy countries. Urban guerrilla groups were forming and carry out armed actions, including the Weather Underground in the US, the Red Army faction in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy, and so on.
The Red Army faction, who were Marxist-Leninists and who, instinctively I felt we would have felt unsympathetic to, with this notion of actually believing that you could take state power. But the more I understand of post-war German history, the more I can understand where they came from, actually. That to know that, large numbers of ex-Nazis were running universities and bureaucracy. I feel much more, I would have felt very unsympathetic at the time, but more recently I feel more sympathetic to...
As John mentions, most of these other groups were very different politically speaking from the Angry Brigade, as most of them had some form of statist, socialist ideology, which saw them wanting to establish socialism or communism through the seizure of state power. In West Germany, not only were former card-carrying Nazis and war criminals running universities, but they were running large parts of the country in all parts of society, from government to the legal system to big business. We've got some books about the RAF available with more info, which we'll link to in the show notes. And we're going to be talking more about the Red Brigades and other armed groups in Italy in our forthcoming mini-series on Italy in the 1960s and 70s. While there were also women involved in these other urban guerrilla groups, proportionately there were more in the Angry Brigade.
Yes, it was a gender-balanced group. It was a gender-balanced movement. I think the women's movement had a huge impact on the development of a revolutionary politics that was not Leninist. It had a huge impact. I mean, at the time, was I think still a really crucial text called The Tyranny of Structurelessness.
By Joe Freeman.
I think it's still a really important text. And she's writing at the moment when there's a transition from women in consciousness-raising groups to women as being politically active. And she talks about that transition in terms of the comrades in the Angry Brigade. Yes, it was gender equal. It was the right thing not to be having... And then she talks about how if you're then moving into activist politics, you do have to then think about structures. Otherwise, you start to get informal elites.
As part of its fight against patriarchy, the Angry Brigade detonated a bomb under a BBC broadcast lorry in the early hours of the morning outside the Miss World contest on the 20th of May 1970. Women's protests also occurred inside and outside the venue later that day, with women pelting the host, comedian Bob Hope, with flower bombs and rotten fruit. While the protests received widespread media coverage, the bombing didn't. 2 weeks later, the group machine-gunned the Spanish embassy in solidarity with 6 Basque nationalists who'd been put on trial, in another action which went unreported.
And then, in December 1970, came the first clue to what was happening. A communiqué was sent to the International Times claiming the bomb attacks, and it was signed Angry Brigade, the first time the words had been used. The communiqué also claimed a machine gun attack on the Spanish embassy. Later, the gun, a .38 Beretta, was proved ballistically to be the same gun that was used on the American embassy 3 years earlier. So here was direct evidence of a link between the 1st of May group and people now calling themselves the Angry Brigade.
Their communiqué claimed that the media blackout was the system, quote, trying to hide the fact of its vulnerability, and stating, quote, we can make ourselves heard in one way or another, end quote. Unlike many other revolutionaries who undertook armed actions in the past, the Angry Brigade were at least realistic in what they thought the potential consequences of their actions would be. Especially as in the past, many took such actions hoping that they would spark some sort of mass uprising, which basically never actually happened.
I don't think that we were that pretentious to think this. This was exemplary stuff that was going to trigger anything. I think it was. I suppose in a way it was a very old-fashioned. You could say it was a very old-fashioned notion of justice. But the idea of making decisions that affect other people without affecting yourself, I thought that this was, within the context, as I say, within the context of which I thought there was going to be a capitalist counter-offensive at this time, I thought that within that context, this was important.
The effective media blackout of the Angry Brigade would end soon after, following a particularly daring attack.
On the night of January 12, 1971, 2 bombs exploded outside the London home of Robert Carr MP. Carr was Edward Heath's employment minister and the man responsible for the hated Industrial Relations Bill, which had passed into law earlier that day.
Alla mattina, appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
That's it for part 1. Our Patreon supporters can listen to part 2 exclusively now on the link below, and it will be available to everyone else in the next couple of weeks. Patrons also get access to an exclusive bonus episode with more tape from our interview. It's only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get great benefits like early access to episodes, ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, discounted merch, and more. If you can't spare the cash though, please don't worry about it, but do tell your friends about this podcast and take a second to give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. We've got a couple of great books about the Angry Brigade as well as an excellent documentary DVD available in our online store, link in the show notes. We've also got John Barker's novel, Futures, set in Thatcher's London. As a listener to this podcast, you can get any of these and anything else in the store 10% off using the discount code WCHPodcast. As always, we've got loads more info on the webpage for this episode, linked in the show notes. So this includes things like sources, links, transcripts eventually, as well as a Radical London playlist John Barker put together for us, which is a curated collection of tracks that were popular in the scene at the time in London's clubs and communes. John's written other books too, like Bend the Bars and Criminal Justice Acts. These are all available on his website, theharrier.net, link in the show notes. Thanks once again to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands, and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Tyler Hill. Thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
Tu mi devi seppellire lassù in montagna. Oh bella ciao, bella